So in my last few videos, I've been going over a bunch of leaks for the first Diablo 4 expansion, going over things like the new mercenary system and the new raid system. But in this video, I wanted to go over what I think is one of the most anticipated parts about the first expansion, being the new class. So the first new class being added to Diablo 4 is called the Spiritborn, and this is going to be a wholly new class for the Diablo franchise. So this isn't a class you'll have played before in a previous Diablo game, and this isn't even a concept that you'll have seen in previous Diablo games or in any of the Diablo universe's lore. And this class also seems to be pretty unique when it comes to the actual mechanics, because some of the most interesting parts about this class is how it's being built and just some of the specific things that are shown in the files. For instance, this class seems to be able to fly, and it seems you actually have control over actually flying around while playing the Spiritborn. But I think a good place to start with this class is going over its resources, because it seems that the Spiritborn is going to have two different primary resources. Now, when these leaks first came out around 5 or 6 months ago, the leaks mentioned that there would be two resources, one being Vigor and one being something called Allegiance. Now, going through these leaked strings, I could only find mention of one of these resources being Vigor, and this was only mentioned in regard to some new affixes being added into the game. For instance, Max Vigor, Vigor on Kill, and then Max Vigor on Jewelry. So some of the affixes we already have in game for other classes being added for one of the resources for the Spiritborn. But we do have other mentions in these files detailing the Spiritborn having two different resources, even some of them mentioning primary and secondary resources, but I couldn't find any mention of this other resource called Allegiance. One thing I did find that I'm not sure if it's the other resource is under a bunch of these files, even some detailing these resources have some mention of Spiritborn Orb. One of the resources could potentially be some Orb resource while the other is Vigor, but not 100% certain on that. Either way we look at it, there are two resources mentioned a bunch within these strings, so it seems like the Spiritborn is going to have two different resources you have to look out for. A lot of other classes in the game do have two resources. You'll have your main resource, which is the right globe, whether it be spirit or energy. Then you'll have some other resources, such as rogues having combo points or necromancers having corpses. So my assumption is it's going to be something along those lines. One main resource that you probably generate over time or through basic skills, and then one resource that's more specific to certain skills. Now, as I mentioned, it seems that the Spiritborn can actually fly, because there are a bunch of these different strings in these files mentioning things like soar, flying, descending, ascending, having different attacks while flying. There's even some of these files mentioning sky control, and when adding all of these different things up, it seems like the Spiritborn can fly, it seems like the Spiritborn can control themselves while flying, and it seems like some skills are also going to be usable while flying. And this mechanic seems pretty new for the entirety of the Diablo franchise. I don't recall any other classes that could legitimately just fly around and use abilities while flying, and I'm also wondering how this is actually going to look being an isometric game with the point of view you have in Diablo, because if this was a third-person game, flying around would kind of make sense. We've seen that before. You really don't see mechanics like this, or what this seems to be like, in games with this point of view. So it does seem to be quite interesting, but things like gameplay feel or animations or things of that nature are things that Blizzard generally gets right almost all of the time. Diablo 4, I think, still has some of the best combat in the ARPG genre, so I'm not too worried about that, but it is quite interesting. And like mentioned, we do have even abilities that are mentioned, so basic projectiles while in the sky, and then even in some of the lists going over the different abilities and talents for the Spiritborn, you even have some additional things that mention the sky, like sky mobility or sky offense. So it does seem like this flying is also built into a bunch of the different mechanics and talents and abilities within the Spiritborn, but I'm not exactly sure where flying is going to fit into the overarching class of the Spiritborn. There is the very real possibility that the unique class mechanic for the Spiritborn is just flying. So instead of having the Book of the Dead of the Necromancer panther or having the spirit boons of a druid, you would instead have this activatable fly ability that may be too much for a unique class mechanic, so it may be more built in to your talents. Maybe it's an ultimate or in some other area of being able to customize the class, but having the ability to fly, I think, is something that most players are just going to want to do. Now, one of the big defining features of the Spiritborn as a class seems to be its connection to nature and kind of the physical world, because even when you go through a lot of the talents shown and abilities shown for the Spiritborn, a lot of them are labeled as one of these elements. So forest, plains, sky, or soil. And as mentioned, there are a lot of talents and other abilities labeled under one of these different elements. So this seems to be one of the main ways the class is built and customized. So for instance, if you look at any of the other Diablo 4 classes when going through, say, their skill trees, you'll have every skill tree labeled as something different, usually something that's connected directly to that class, and presumably that's what these different sections are going to be. One section would be forest abilities, one would be plain abilities, one would be sky abilities, which could potentially also be the flying mechanic, and then one would be soil abilities. So everything very connected to the lore of the class, being very connected to just nature and the physical world. And it seems there's also some extensions to that, because there are files mentioning there being things like swipes and even claw swipes. There was also a mention of panthers within these files, so it does also seem like the Spiritborn is either going to be able to change into a panther potentially, or they're going to be able to summon a panther to help them. So that may be just an ability. Maybe you have one ability where you can transform into like a panther, or as mentioned, there may be just like one ability where you can have a companion or summon that's a panther, which would make sense as a Spiritborn is very connected to nature. So being able to have some creature help them or be able to transform into a creature would make sense. But I do think they have to be pretty careful with this, because being able to have too many like animal companions or being able to transform into different things too much could encroach on the kind of play style and aesthetic of the druid. The druid already has a bunch of animal companions. They are nature based, so they have that as a similarity, and they're also the transforming class. So presumably if there is something to where you can summon an animal companion or turn into an animal, it'll probably be a very limited part of the Spiritborn. Now, surprisingly, there wasn't a ton of files detailing specific abilities. For instance, a lot of, say, the mercenaries or even some of the other classes in the game in these files had a bunch of their abilities detailed in these long strings. When I went over the mercenary thing, we just went through lists of different named abilities for those, but the Spiritborn didn't have as much of that. Now, something that they did have is just pretty long list of talents being detailed, but these were more the categories. As I mentioned, the different sky or soil categories. Then we had something like the ultimates being detailed, but again, not specific names, just the 1 through 12 ultimates, which does make sense because every class has 4 different ultimates with 2 upgrades for each ultimate. So that comes out to 12. So this is obviously just detailing the ultimate category as a whole. So a lot of categories, but not much actual specifics on their abilities. But one interesting thing is Invoke. And you can find Invoke throughout a bunch of these different files, and it seems to be some type of connector to a lot of the other elements of the Spiritborn. So instance, there's a list of Invoke Sky, Invoke Plains, Invoke Forest, Invoke Soil. Then you also have things like Invoke Cast Motion Blur, Cast Spirit, Cast Buffs. And that's not everything that is mentioned with this Invoke, but as mentioned, it does seem this Invoke kind of connects to a lot of other elements of this build. So this could also be the potential unique class mechanic of the Spiritborn. Because as this Invoke thing is connected to a lot of elements of the build, it also could potentially be some element to switch between different forms of the Spiritborn. Because as mentioned, it has all these different elements like the skies and the plains, and these Invoke being connected to those could be some sort of stance switching to where maybe you invoke sky, you now switch to kind of the sky version of the Spiritborn, or you invoke plains, so now you're switching to have the plains version. And maybe there's different abilities you can use when invoking these different elements. And one of the reasons I say this is because when the initial leaks came out, some of these initial leaks actually mentioned the Spiritborn kind of having two different sides. So my initial theory was that the Spiritborn would have basically stances you could switch between. And we see this in a lot of other games. A bunch of different MOBAs actually have this element to where you have like a character that's kind of one side. Maybe this character is a light character, but then they switch stances to like a dark character and they have a whole different slew of abilities to use in those different stances. And that would actually be a pretty interesting mechanic when it comes to Diablo 4 or even just the Diablo franchise. We really don't have a lot of classes that kind of have this stance shifting element. And depending on how it's done, it can be very interesting. Those are some of the most interesting but also complex characters when looking at other games that have this kind of full stance switching, where you have one element with all its own abilities, then you switch and you have a bunch of additional abilities depending on which stance or element you're currently in. And that would definitely be something I'm pretty interested in because that adds just so many different gameplay possibilities. But that's actually a lot of the information I could glean from these files for the Spiritborn. Now, as I mentioned, these files were obtained probably 5 to 6 months ago, and this first expansion is coming out at the end of this year. So this will have been a long time before the actual launch of this expansion. So presumably a lot of the different elements of the Spiritborn weren't in these files and weren't fully built yet, which would make sense because it was so early on. But overall, I do think this class seems to be pretty interesting. And I know a lot of people want like a paladin or a crusader or a holy base class, but I do think going the route the developers did where they want something completely unique to the entirety of the Diablo franchise as their first class is going to be a very interesting addition to the game, because something wholly new just allows them to experiment with very new and interesting mechanics. So I'm personally pretty excited for this class. I think a lot of the things we've been able to see from the leaks does seem to be pretty interesting for a new class. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.